You're listening to AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. This is The Gailey Show. I am your host, JP D'Arbragosian. We are your answer to the question, what is a queer thing I can read, watch, or go to in the Twin Cities and beyond for the upcoming week? And I have a book today that I think you're going to want to add to your reading list immediately. My guest today is KB Brookins. Their new book, Pretty, just came out earlier this summer. I'm really excited to talk to KB about it. So KB, welcome to The Gailey Show.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat.
Absolutely. So why don't you get us started with Pretty, describing it for our audience?
Yes, so Pretty is a memoir on queerness, masculinity, and race. It talks a lot about what it was like for me to kind of become who I am, a Black, queer, and trans person in Texas. I am what they call a career Texan. I am born, raised, and based in Texas. And I chat quite a bit, about my specific experience, but I found that these experiences that I talk about are pretty universal for people like me and people with comparable experiences. So, I dive into very, specific instances of going to the gynecologist, as a person who looks the way that I do, and the challenges associated with that. Getting my name and gender marker changed, in the state that I live in, but of course, like other states have, comparable things. I chat about just getting in tune with my body and creating my own masculinity. So it's just a lot about, what it's been like to live the life that I've lived, and also my kind of call for change in areas of queerphobia, transphobia, and making sure that our queer and trans communities are reflective of Black trans folk and people like me.
I do want to get into your advocacy work, but first, your first two publications were poetry, and this is prose. So, and I love asking poets, what brought you to the dark side of prose?
The dark side. That's so funny because I feel like prose writers would think of poetry as the dark side. So it's nice to hear that flip.
I think pros think of poets as oh my goodness, you're all in rarefied air. You made it to the top of the mountain, and we're just no, we don't even understand what gear you take to get to the top of the mountain.
It's funny. I think it's perceived so elusive, so compressed in its approach to language. And I think poetry was my first love, really. I started writing poetry at an after-school poetry society in high school. So it's the longest relationship and the healthiest relationship that I've had. I definitely thought of myself as a poet that would only write poetry books for a really long time. And I started to, especially during early days of quarantine, just write about the things that I was seeing kind of change before my eyes. I started my medical transition in December of 2020. And I kind of just was able to chart we do treat people differently based on how they look. Right. And so then, and when I started, getting a deep voice, getting facial hair, getting a flat chest, all of those things just impacted so much the way that I could exist or not in public space. And then I started just thinking about, past events that have kind of led me to this path that I've been on as a writer, as a cultural worker, etc. And I was just as all things are, they're connected, right? The things that I do now are just heavily informed by things that maybe happened when I was 5, maybe happened when I was 12, X, Y, and Z. And I found that trying to talk about those things through poetry just posed adversity in the sense of I was trying to tell a story and I felt like it was the wrong form. So then I just started telling stories in the way that I did to my friends on the page. I'm a writer that writes the way that I talk too. So I started doing that, and then I was I guess this is nonfiction, question mark. And yeah, started going to and talking to nonfiction writers about their process and kind of the rules of their genre. And so I found myself kind of just naturally, because I was writing poems and they were kind of failing me, naturally going to nonfiction. And I also think there's a lot of power in saying like, hey, this happened to me. This is not a metaphor. This is not, fantastical in any way. Like, this is just the everyday life of Black trans people in the US. So yeah, I just started doing that, and then I didn't stop until I had a book. And then I was like, what am I going to do with this book? Is it just going to sit in my Google Docs forever? And then, I guess just one thing led after another. So it felt just really natural to move into that, because I felt like I needed to just like confess some things and also say some things in a different storytelling medium.
Confession can be tricky in memoir. So what was that like for you in deciding what to include and what not to include in a memoir?
Absolutely. I think my memoir is really driven by theme. So queerness, masculinity, race, like all of those are kind of the three major themes of the book. So I had to kind of cherry pick, because a memoir can't be like every day of your life. It would be so boring if it was. Right? Because a lot of us have like very unmiraculous things about us, right? So I had to kind of cherry pick moments that I felt like fit into those themes. And just moments that felt like they were of resonance with other moments that maybe happened at different times. So it was a matter of me kind of looking through things that I was thinking about, and also looking through even like poems that I had written when I thought this was going to be a poetry book, and be like, all right, so what feels like it's kind of rising to the surface. And I especially am drawn, and maybe this is a poetic impulse, by like complication, where I'm like, I don't know actually like what I learned, from this experience, or it doesn't have that neat, like, oh, what did we learn today type of like quality to it. It's still something that impacts me, right? And I especially was drawn to those things. I especially was drawn to things where there was no clear like hero or villain. There were just like people. And so I wanted to kind of like put all of those things together, put them really messily at first, just like in a Google Doc, and then had an editor, which, they shout out to editors. They have such patience. Was kind of sending it to my editor at Knopf, Earl McDonald, like, okay, what am I doing here? What do you feel like is like kind of gelling together, and what feels like it's like an outlier? And he was able to definitely add some perspective to that as well. But really, ultimately, I wanted these to be intentionally so things that like prompt discussion, things that prompt for a reader, like, oh, I don't know who was the like right person in this situation, but regardless of if you see me as, the hero of the story, I still want you to see, Black trans people as people who deserve rights, people who deserve respect, and also for people to think about the ways that we gender everything that we see, and how that is like a social phenomenon, right? Even before someone is born, we say it's a girl and immediately have assumptions about who a person is going to be. So I just wanted to kind of bring those things to the surface and talk about how those assumptions can be harmful, right, to people who don't fit into those boxes.
As an essayist, I would label myself, when I get into a particular piece, I don't really know what's going to end up being fun to write, or if it's going to be tricky to write, or if I'm like, oh, this is going to be a slog. Was there a section or a chapter within Pretty that you found to be joyous to write? Like you really enjoy, you're like, wow, I'm really enjoying telling this joy of my story.
Yeah, I feel like so much of it was like, oh my gosh, why did I decide to write something so heavy? But I think like one piece in particular probably was easier for me to write because it felt like a story of triumph. So I have a piece in here talking about how I learned to love my chest, right? For a really long time in my life, I was very dysphoric about how my chest looked, because it felt like the one identifier where people were like, oh, this is a girl, right? In any other context, they would like question it, but then when they got right on me and like saw my chest, it would be like that. So it made me feel super self-conscious. And I talk about, the complication that they gave me as a young person and also a young adult. And then it goes into kind of, just learning to love one's body, learning to also like listen to yourself. For so long, right, I like prolonged the idea of top surgery because I was so worried about what people would think, right? And I think there's something just like really beautiful once you like let go of those things, right? And it's really hard not to stay in that mode of like, what will people think? What will people think? Because what people think does like impact like how we exist in public space, right? What jobs we can or can't get, like even stuff like that. So, I feel great privilege to be able to be a trans person that was able to get gender affirming surgery and like live in my body in a way that feels finally kind of free. So I write about that in hopes that, readers who don't know what that's like, right? Because so much of the internet, so much of media right now is like hypothesizing about, what is and isn't true about trans people and their bodies. But I'm like, well, I am a trans person. I'm telling you what it's been like to live in my body and what I've had to do in order to both accept it and change some things in order to like truly feel like even like something like hugging, right?
Yeah.
You think about like, okay, some people that like don't even feel comfortable like with touch in that way because of their bodies, right? So I really try to break down, the psychology behind it, but also like the just like denial of touch behind that. So yeah, I really like that story because it feels like a coming home, right? In the story of being like, I touch myself all the time now, which sounds silly, but it's like, when you like, when you look in the mirror and you don't see something that feels real or that feels like you, it can just be like you're somehow detached. And I'm talking and I'm telling a story about how now I'm attached to my body and how that feels so good and everyone should be allowed to feel that way.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations on the book. It's very exciting to have that in the world. And I want to ask you as well, because I think a lot of folks outside of Texas have a lot of preconceived notions of what it's like to do queer advocacy within the state of Texas. And you're doing that largely within Central Texas. So what is it like? What's happening right now? What's the state of play?
Large question. Well,
yeah, I know, right? And do it in 2 minutes.
Yeah, Austin, where I'm at, is actually like the third queer city in the U.S. Right? A lot of people don't think of Texas as a very like queer state because of like what politics look like, and in some regards that's understandable. But in others, I'm like, you really just need to talk to people actually from here and actually who live here, and you will, do away with those preconceived notions. But I'm in Central Texas, in Austin, where I'm, miles away from the capital, which is where, all of the anti-queer and anti-trans laws are passed. And I see the activism and I see the advocacy that happens, and I know that, there is a lot of work being done to combat, those things. I want to shout out two organizations in particular who are doing great work. One is Trans Education Network of Texas. They're run by trans people of color, and they, year-round provide services to trans people in the state. There's also Equality Texas, who tracks legislation as it pertains to queer and trans laws. They track both like positive, because there are some positive laws being passed. Like just, in May of 2024, Austin passed a law that said that they will not, enact the anti-trans, the bill that was passed at the Texas level that was like anti-trans kids, essentially. So it's like, people here care about those things. And we've created such a robust queer and trans community, like the drag scene, in Texas. I feel like it's just so robust and unmatched. We have our queer communities. I'm part of a series that happens, every couple of quarters named Black and Queer AF. Like, there are just such cool things, right, happening here. And such important people like doing important things to make it so queer and trans people can thrive here. And I
love
talk about that, right?
I love that. I'm really glad to hear that. I am a little pressed for time. Tell us how we can follow you on social media.
Yeah, I am at Earth2KB, EARTHTOKB, on all platforms. Twitter, I refuse to call it X, Instagram, TikTok, all that.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for being on the show, KB. Our podcasts are executive produced by Jim Pounds. Follow us on Instagram at @_Gailey Show. And until next Saturday, see you queers and allies in the bookstores.